The technical session on biodiversity conservation is about to start. May I call upon Dr. M. Balakrishnan, chair of the session, to come to the dais. On behalf of the Community Agrobiodiversity Center, I extend a warm welcome to Dr. M. Balakrishnan for chairing this session. I also invite Dr. Israel Oliver King, co-chair of this session. Let me also extend warm welcome to our speakers, distinguished speakers, Dr. Anil Kumar, Dr. Sanjay Deshmukh, Dr. Sri Kumar, and Dr. Sunitha Subramanian online. Yeah, Dr. Sri Kumar. I request Dr. Oliver King, co-chair, to introduce the chair and speakers. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege and honor to introduce the chair of the session on biodiversity conservation. Dr. M. Balakrishnan, former professor of geological sciences from the Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia, and also he served as a professor in geology department in University of Kerala as well. He's basically a tropical ecologist and specialist, and he has also served in the Norwegian Center of International Agriculture Development in the Agricultural University of Norway. And we have eminent panelists here on board, and Dr. Anil Kumar, needless to introduce here. Dr. Anil Kumar is an angiosperm taxonomist, and he has served for the foundation over 25 years, and he has been instrumental for development of various programs of the biodiversity at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. And we have Dr. Sanjay Deshmukh, and also he was alumni of MS Swaminathan Foundation, and he also served as a Vice Chancellor of University of Mumbai, and currently is also holding a position in the university. And basically he's a kind of coastal system specialist, and he will be contributing in the session. And we have Dr. K.M. Sri Kumar, and is currently serving as a professor and head of the Department of Agricultural Entomology in the Kerala Agricultural University. And basically his specialization involves agricultural entomology and biological control. And we have another panelist online, and Dr. Sunitha Subramanian, and she's a research fellow, United Nations University, Institute of Advanced Studies, Japan, and she currently works with the Biodiplomacy Initiative in Tokyo, and she has a specialization in the area of medicinal plants and also ecosystem services evaluation. So we have 4 eminent panelists with us, and I request now the chair of the session, Dr. Balakrishnan, to lead the session. Over to Dr. Balakrishnan.
Good morning to all of you. I'm extremely thankful to the organizers of this meeting, seminar, for giving me this opportunity to be here and also to chair the session and attend the views of participants on biodiversity and its conservation. In fact, I have never thought of attending a meeting of this type in Wayanad. Having studied from grade 1 to grade 10 in Sultan Bathery those days, long time back in the early 60s, late 50s and early 60s, and took my PhD in 1975. And I feel that I was the first one to take a PhD having a basic school education in Wayanad. And I felt those days, so proud. And even though I have visited several countries, attended several meetings, seminars, international conferences, and also worked abroad for a long time. And this is the first time that I am participating in a scientific program in Wayanad. So that's why I'm very happy this morning. Today, in this session, we have 4 presentations, and all these presentations are on conservation of biodiversity, a topic I have studied. Also, I taught. Probably I'm the first one to introduce a credit semester program on biodiversity conservation in India in 1992 as part of our MSc curriculum. Started for zoology students, but later master's students in botany, master's students in environmental sciences, and also some of the students of arts group, MA group, also joined and opted this as a course. And I continued with this course until 2002 when I left for Ethiopia. So very long time I've been teaching this. In Ethiopia also I was teaching ecology and biodiversity conservation. With this basic introduction, I now invite the first speaker, Dr. Anil Kumar, Senior Director of this institute, for his presentation. You have 20 minutes time.
Yeah. You can stop me before, maybe 2 minutes before, and then, I'll have. Slides are visible? There. Good morning to everyone. So we are on an important discussion, I would say. These 2 days deliberation, we have selected this ABC of sustainable development, or ABC of, today I heard a phrase, the resilient development. So the ABC is the adaptation, biodiversity, and climate change. So which anyone, whether you are a policymaker or you're a farmer or a scientist, I would say this is the basic kind of frame where we have to work. So my topic, the given topic is in-situ community-based conservation. So if you see the keywords, in-site, wherever it is originated, you conserve. But it should be community-based. Today, the previous speakers, when I listened to them, they said the data deficiency. So data deficiency, when you see not the ecological data, we have ecological data or environmental data, but for conservation, this data alone is not sufficient. It is insufficient, I would say. We need data from different quarters. So what I am, next 15 minutes, I will go through the kind of framework or a theory of change where, how effectively we can do this community-based conservation. So how do we revitalize and sustain this approach to better adaptation and risk reductions? So risk, when I say, not only they're related to the climate change, so many other risks. So our insights, largely my insights, when I say I have 30 years of experience with this field. So probably the insights come from my own field level interventions, largely with MSSRF, and the interventions and the impacts. So if you see, I am trying to give you the kind of issues always not come in a kind of singular way. It comes in a cyclic way. Always believe that. Always see that. So the there are 5 cycles which I am trying to introduce to you. So before that, if you see the biodiversity, what are the elements of biodiversity we are talking about? We are talking about the diversities in ecosystems, to the diversity within species and between species, which means, it is this part of definition people know. But when it comes to the community biodiversity, we often ignore the human habitations. The human habitations which maintain the biodiversity. As actually, if you want to conserve the biodiversity, you have to not only conserve those red founded ones, the forest, the rivers, the other water bodies, your grasslands and agroforest and so on, but we should have the bottom elements, the human habitations and the traditional knowledge of the custodian community, who is conserving this biodiversity. So this diversity, now it is referred as community biodiversity. So when I say in-situ on-farm conservation, I am referring to the community biodiversity. The center, actually the name, the Community Biodiversity Center. So alternatively, there is a name now, which thanks to Japanese initiative, it is called the Satayama Initiative. Or the Satayama Initiative, they call these community landscapes as socio-ecological production landscapes, because it is not only the environmental landscapes, it is socio-ecological production landscapes. So this is, if you see what are where are these production landscapes rich in India? I would say India's Malabar region. Historically, it is the Western Ghats was called as Malabar. So this Malabar region is very rich in the socio-ecological production landscapes. So when it comes to the in-situ conservation, or ex-situ, or on-farm, or community-based conservation, there are several key challenges. So let me list out some of the challenges there. The degradation and the destruction, I would say, not only degradation, destruction, and conversion of forest and wild habitats. In the name of development, we have to develop. I'm not going into the issues there. And the land system change and the land use change. We are changing our land use drastically, and we are changing the land system configuration drastically. And there is a farming system change. So, whatever name you call it, but the farming system, whether it is good for or bad, but there is a change. So the farming system change and the agricultural simplification. So you can change, but you cannot simplify the agriculture, because you are talking about a resilient development. So the agricultural simplification and the loss of biocultural traditions, because when I say biocultural tradition, the cultural tradition related with that on-farm conservation. And the economic viability of conservation, because this is where the economists come in the picture. Say, when you conserve, whether it is economically viable or not. So how best we do the conservation? This is what the challenge. By addressing these challenges, I would say the conservation challenge, particularly the community biodiversity challenge, has to be, this is the push and pull. When the conservation pulls, the cultivation, the cultivation has to pull in. See, this cultivation, their key challenges, if you see, lack of adaptive agriculture. When we say adaptation, how the agriculture is adapting, this is where science has to come in. So the lack of adaptive agricultural practices and skills of modern system. Today when I listened, they were talking about the technological interventions for the adaptation. We need both. So the loss of plant and animal genetic diversity. This part, quite often people don't know how much diversity within species we have and how this diversity is eroding. And finally, I'm not reading out everything, how we can make the agricultural landscapes as a carbon sink rather than a carbon source. Now the agriculture is a carbon source, agricultural system. Nearly 27% of the emission comes from the agriculture and allied systems. So how do we make this source to sink? So this is where it is very, very critical. And closing the yield gap. This is where all the developmental actors jump in. How we have to close the yield gap? We have to close the yield gap, but just based on the technological interventions alone. And the cultivation cannot be sustained itself. Cultivation has to be pulled by consumption because you the demand. The other was the supply side. From the demand side, from the pull side, the key challenges but. So how do we harness nutrition from the neglected and underutilized species? When you conserve a neglected and underutilized, whether it is a millet or whether it is a yam or whether it is a banana, you are actually conserving the nutrition asset, nutrition capital, and addressing the malnutrition, whole lot of things, and producing health food. Today the world is talking about health food. Health food is the food is safe to eat and from a healthy ecosystem. So health food means not only healthy for you, but healthy for the ecosystem. So that a challenge, apart from the food waste and food loss, that is a big challenge. So when I say biodiversity on farm, conservation, following cultivation, and following consumption, finally the commerce side. This is where, the kind of economic side of the development. Quite often we see only this pillar. We ignore the ecological pillar, we ignore the social pillar. We have to see all the three pillars together. But here this key challenge, Professor used to tell, good ecology is good business. Definitely good ecology is good business. If you take ecotourism alone, this Wayanad district, for example, in this campus alone, if you take, we can promote the tourism. So finding an economic stake in conservation, that is very critical, and new markets for the neglected and underutilized species. And above all, so these 4 C cycles, above all another C, the climate change cycle. So this is the overarching circle. So this overarching circle, the key risk for a farmer, he doesn't know whether this globe is warming or not, but he knows the extreme weather events. He knows the untimely rain. He knows, the kind of, so for a farmer, the untimely and uneven rain, the temperature increase he feels, and the scarce or surplus water availability. For example, in Wayanad, we had surplus water during the last many years, and we have land degradation, and we have invasion of unfamiliar biodiversity, invasive species. Farmers themselves, they used to comment, sir, this kind of diversity we had never seen, but this diversity is coming in. So these cycles of key challenges, if the absence or its presence of these cycles make the kind of, the conservation. So these pull and push factors of these 5 C's, how do we address? So we can address by innovative interventions. This is where researchers come in. And the researchers, not necessarily the formal system researchers, the rural innovations, which we talk about. India has got so much of rural innovations. So do differently the biodiversity conservation research and action. Not academically, not the university system. The kind of, you should be able to do the innovative research intervention. You have to have incentive mechanism. When I conserve, what is the kind of incentive I am getting? How do you incentivize the conservation? So this is where, the good business creation from the good ecology. And how do you integrate the farming system? So you need integrated farming system, not the kind of, the monocultural farming system. And you have to maximize the integration in a cost-effective manner. And you need institutions of grassroots. You need institutions of grassroots. I am a firm believer of grassroots institutions. Otherwise, you cannot make any change. You have to have, and Kerala, if you take the Western Ghats, particularly the Kerala region, we have the powerful panchayats. So these are the grassroots institutions. And above all, the 5th I, these are 5 I proposal I am making, insulation to climate change impacts. How do you insulate this impact? The biodiversity is the answer. The community biodiversity is the answer. Today morning, Madura ji was telling, the biodiversity is getting distracted by climate change, but biodiversity is contributing to the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So how do we make the ecosystems and biodiversity-based adaptation? You call it nature-based or ecosystem-based or biodiversity-based adaptation and mitigation as the most effective insulation mechanism to climate change impact. So this is, I'm giving you some case study example from this organization, the Community Agro-Biodiversity Center, in that 5I framework. So the innovative intervention, what were the innovative interventions by MSSRF? I would say the Community Agro-Biodiversity Center itself. That is a very innovative idea, I would say. Swaminathan visualized 25 years back, and he wrote himself the vision document, very, very elaborate way. So I suggest we need more and more community agro-biodiversity centers. And we need community seed banks, where the seed system. We have MSSRF has very good examples. And we need conservation garden, not the typical botanical garden. When I say botanical garden in quote, the botanical garden of the global north and the botanical garden of the global south is different actually. See, the global south botanical garden is a conservation garden, where you have this genetic diversity for the conservation. And the incentive mechanism, if you take the globally important agricultural heritage system, that is a eco-certification. We made 2 sites in India as the first GR sites from country. Korapattu tribal agricultural system and Kuttanad below sea level farming system. And we have this custodian farmer networks. And we have promoted the farmers markets. You can see there the kind of interventions, MSSRF intervention. If you see, for example, institutions of grassroots. Dr. Rangalakshmi is here, and thanks to late Meena Swaminathan ji, she was so convinced, unless you gendered sensitive community institutions, grassroots institutions in the society, you cannot make any change. So we have these institutions, and these institutions, for example, seed care, for in Wayanad, and we have farmer producer organization that is now well established. And in case of this adaptation insulation practices, eco-restoration of degraded species, degraded land, with RET plants, not the common plants, the rare plants, or the endemic plants, or the threatened plants, not ordinarily available plants. And the landscape or watershed-oriented land use management, and the capacity building of local self-governments towards the SDG-oriented or the climate resilient-oriented local development. So this is the case study from the CAbC MSSRF. But how do we, these interventions, what were the impacts? Impacts, I tried to put it into 3 levels: the ecological impacts, the social impacts, and the economical impacts. If you see the ecological impacts, now, I would say now people like Divagaretan and the former MLA are here. We were the first people who talked about the importance of ecology, agroecology, and biodiversity in agricultural development and the overall rural development. So now there is a growing demand. There is an interest for having a mix of both traditional and modern crop varieties, planting RET plant species, and eco-restoration. There is a trend. So I would say that at least in Wayanad, at least in this part of Wayanad, so we had contributed there. And if you see our collections, Jemblas and conservation of over 300 farmers varieties. Farmers varieties over 300. I would say it's the largest collection perhaps in Kerala, having this many diversity on farm. No, not within this farm, but we have custodian farmers, and which includes rice, which includes banana, mango, legumes, yams, and so on. And we have ex-situ conservation. So these, I'm not reading out the social impacts, the economical impacts. And these impacts, you may see it is local. So how do we upscale or replicate these impacts? So this is where these 2 acts come in. The Biodiversity Act. Again, MSSRF was the organization drafted the initial draft of the Biodiversity Act. And this very idea came here in Wayanad, way back in 1996, when we held the steering committee of the first steering committee of CAbC. Then Professor M.K. Prasad, late M.K. Prasad, he suggested to have this kind of an approach. So we need, I'm not going, the different classes are there, biodiversity management committees, the most stronghold institution, grassroots institution. Unless we build the capacity of biodiversity management committee, we may not be able to do that. And the Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act. So these two acts, and the kind of synergized action. Now these two acts are being implemented, but they are not in the coordinated action. They are in the isolated action. How do we get to the synergized action there? And for the CAbC, the way forward, I'm here, so I can, I'm not explaining, but we should have 4 areas of focus. We should do the biodiversity research. We have to revisit how innovative we are. So we have to have that biodiversity research component strengthened and build the capacity of the local self-governments, build the local biodiversity fund, because nothing will happen unless you have fund. So the Act have provision for fund, and we have to build networks. I would say we have to build networks of all the concerned organizations. So I think that is my last slide. So I conclude by not only thanking you, listening me, I am thanking actually Professor Swaminathan, who had, in fact, that's what he is such an extraordinary human being, a scientist and conservationist. And I had several occasions to translate him whenever he is in Kerala. So that, helped me to understand his concept more closely. And if at all I achieved something, I would thank him. So with this, I stop here, and thank you so much. Thank you.
I would also suggest the participants, in case if you have any question, you have to put forward, and we will have discussion at the end of the session. Thank you very much, Doctor. Now I would invite the second presenter of the session, Dr. Sanjay. Yeah. Professor, yeah, Dr. Sanjay. Professor Sanjay Deshmukh from Mumbai.
Thank you very much, Chairman. At the outset, I would like to congratulate all of you on the occasion of commemoration of 25th year of CAbC, the Community Agro-Biodiversity Center of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, which also coincides with the World Environment Day. So I would like to convey my best wishes to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me this opportunity, and I would like to largely thank the MSSRF community for making me what I am today, because I've been one of the first entrants of the Swaminathan Foundation as early as in 1988 in capacity as a consultant, and then I became a full-time employee in 1990. Today we have Honorable Chairperson of the Swaminathan Foundation, Dr. Madura Swaminathan. She and both her sisters have been an inspiration to me. Thank you very much, Madura. We have the Executive Director, Dr. Hariharan, I'm sorry. Dr. Raman from Chennai and other colleagues from Chennai have come. We have Senior Director from here, Dr. Anil Kumar, and one of my old-time friends, the Director, Dr. Shakila, the Chairperson of the Advisory Committee of Wayanad Center, Shri Narayanan, family members of Professor, eminent scientists and participants, also the people's representatives of the state of Kerala and the policy makers who are present here. It's a great honor to be here and sharing my views on the biological diversity conservation, particularly in the context of climate adaptation and the community-based approach, particularly in Maharashtra. I was scheduled to speak tomorrow because the area in which I have largely worked falls tomorrow. However, the opportunities that I got by working with different NGOs and the organizations during the last 32 years have prompted me to contribute to many such areas where I am standing before you. And I'll be talking about community-based biodiversity conservation. I call it CAbC. That will be the future approach I feel for the CAbC to take forward after completion of 25 years. One of my PhD students, Dr. Milind Patil, has been working in this area with me for last 3 years, and therefore I would like to make him as a co-author of this particular presentation. The biodiversity conservation concepts since the inception of the foundation since '88 that I was able to absorb and imbibe talked about various aspects, but it was all anticipatory research. The calamities that are coming, they were envisaged and sensed by visionary global scientists like Dr. Swaminathan, and they were put forth. They became guidelines and pathways for the global community to follow. And therefore, we are very privileged that the centers that were established in the following years in almost 8 states have been carrying forward the agenda that cannot complete for the next several decades. But we have always been able to guide the global communities with respect to conservation of nature and natural resources. As all of us understand, the policymakers, the scientists are always going to get the credit of doing something. But the data that is generated with the help of the local communities, the knowledge gainers from generations over a period of centuries, their contribution is hardly recognized. And therefore, the inception of the center, the CAbC, was a brilliant idea by Professor, and the person whom he chose, Dr. Anil Kumar, I think I should spend half a minute on him. The center completes 25 years. Dr. Anil Kumar not only completes 30 years of his association with MSSRF, but also will complete 60 years of his life next month. And therefore, I would like to acknowledge his contribution to the foundation and to the global community with respect to providing guidelines and leadership in the area of community-based conservation of biological diversity. One life is not sufficient, as we know, and as Dr. Swaminathan is giving that vision to us, standing there like a lighthouse, providing guidance to the entire world. The CAbC concepts I would like to highlight and spend about 5 minutes in the last part of my presentation. I will not exceed my time, even though I have spent about 5 minutes in the introduction to the acknowledgement of the people present here as well as the subject. What I'm trying to highlight here is the map of the world, which within the 60 kilometers belt from the coastal areas, as you can see in this map, not only provides the conglomeration of the human beings, almost 63% of the global population is residing in 60 kilometer belt of the world. And also the biological diversity, the biodiversity hotspots, the red color patches that you see in this map, they provide habitation to almost 44% of all species of vascular plants, 29 species of birds, 275 species of endemic mammals, 38% of endemic reptiles, and 53% of endemic amphibian species within the biodiversity hotspots. And we are only one among 1.7 million species on this planet. What about providing equitable sharing of the resources that we enjoy as one single species out of these 1.7 million species? And when these questions arise, we talk about biological diversity and keep on debating over the last 30 years since 1992. at a global level, but we have still not been able to find solutions. However, meetings that we undertake and we talk about sustainable development goals, we have not been able to reach 10% of the targets that we have set in. And therefore, India, with its strategic position on the map of the world, can provide solutions, and we have proved time and again for the last 3 to 4 decades with respect to our role in conserving biological resources. There are major threats that all of us know, and they are currently and off late of invasive species, which is a very major concern, and other threats are common. We have been talking about them, we have been trying to find solutions. But how do we contribute to providing solutions to these problems as researchers? When we talk about research, we talk about conservation. As you saw from the map of the world which I showed you, unfortunately the biodiversity-rich countries are economically poor, and the tropical belt, which houses about 77% of the biological diversity, is also house of almost 75% of the world's poor. And therefore, when we talk about GDP, of course the national gross happiness is also another terminology. But the GDP that was always considered as a mark of economic upliftment or economic prosperity of a nation, 500 years before today, you see the left-hand side bar chart, 23% of the world's GDP was contribution of India. And in the year 2000, the same amount of percentage was taken over by the United States of America. But if you know, and all of us know, that 500 years before today, the US was not on the map of the world. It was not existing at all. And that is how the GDP has its own limitations. We cannot look at only GDP as a source of providing indication of prosperity of a nation. And therefore the gross national happiness, which is linked directly with the utility, with the conservation efforts and the knowledge traditionally imbibed and passed on to the next generations by our forefathers, comes into picture. And this very center has contributed a great deal. And I feel it is time now, after 25 years, that we start talking about it at every platform that we go. And one of the best presentations that I have heard of Dr. Anil Kumar is today's presentation, I should say. The way he has articulated those slides and the highlights of concentration and contribution of the center and the way forward, with some of the best points that you have given. And I think that should be the way where we can come out, in addition to the outcomes of this meeting, towards the conservation, community-based conservation of biodiversity. And as I said, Swaminathan Foundation has shown that path, even though the word I'm talking as CAbC. The path that has been shown by the foundation has been now acknowledged globally. In the last 25 years particularly, the foundation has revitalized community-based biodiversity conservation in the context of climate adaptation in the following 2 points that I have highlighted here. By creating economic stake in conservation through the 4C approach, which Dr. Swaminathan has coined, that is the management of agrobiodiversity involving concurrent attention of conservation, cultivation, consumption and commerce, and revitalizing and promoting the community tradition of creating gene, seed, grain and water banks, which help to develop sustainable food and water security systems at local levels. I continued the work and the ideas that I gathered from the foundation in all the 6 areas that the foundation envisaged and implemented under the program areas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and special projects. And I was able to work with different organizations, taking forward those ideas and implementing those within the vision of the respective organizations that I worked with. The Sacred Grove was one of the major areas I worked when I was in BNHS, and we, under the World Bank project, documented 3,800 sacred groves in Maharashtra alone, and 80% of them were physically verified. The sacred grove conservation is not only restricted to the traditional knowledge, but also the policies and the pressure of population which has come in over a period of last several decades. We were able to take that work forward, and in the last 10 years' time, we have been able to look at homestead gardens, the community-based efforts in conservation of forest areas, within them the sacred groves, the tribal people, the domesticated plants, and also the population which is able to have forests which are now owned by them, because after the 1980 Act, anything which is defined as forest, even though it is a private land, it is under the forest. So the privately owned forests, the homestead gardens, the community areas and so on have really contributed to the conservation of a conglomeration of different species of plants, animals, birds, and microorganisms. I'm just trying to give highlights in next 1 or 2 minutes. The sacred groves at Shirshinge village we have been able to document further in the last 10 years particularly. And specific areas like biodiversity hotspots, there are some of the villages in Sindhudurg district of Maharashtra in the form of sacred groves. As all of us know, the deities are assigned to the sacred groves so that we can preserve them with the feeling that there is an element of God within the sacred groves. And we also have those without the deities association and still they have been preserved. We have community-based conservation as you see in the Shivapur village. Then we have community-owned forests where the models of in-situ conservation can be seen. Again, privately owned forest where a 200-year-old tree of mango has been preserved. It is called Haldiche Nerur, that is the Nerur where predominantly what we call it as haldi is grown in that particular village. But the privately owned forests have preserved the biological diversity. The in-situ conservation model in another privately owned forest is seen here in Munagi village. Then we have homestead gardens, which are models for ex-situ conservation. The indigenously observed species have been domesticated, but with the same vigor and probably the same content of its utility value. And this is one species, Mesua feria. Then you have black pepper cultivation on native trees in the home gardens. You can see. You also have the indigenously observed species of mushrooms. The wild edible mushrooms also have been domesticated within the privately owned forest areas or home gardens. We have models for ex-situ conservation of bamboo genetic resources, and you can see the Dendrocalamus toxi, the local bamboo conservation in series of photographs that you can see here. And then the nurseries of bamboo of different species have also been the effort of community-owned traditional knowledge, which we have been able to take forward. Then we have preservation and cultivation of Canarium strictum saplings, which have been also an activity of local population. The tribal population within the forest, depending on the forest resources, is different, but some of them who have been also able to get themselves towards the urban areas are still following the traditional practice, and we have been able to involve them in development of nurseries of these rare and endangered species. The local banana germplasm is another activity of homestead garden. We have also models of ex-situ conservation with respect to apiculture, and we have been able to preserve some of those traditions which are observed for ages. The black pepper vines is another example. Again, the bamboo nursery. My student has taken career as a farmer, even though he has done MSc Forestry, Milind Patil, and he has been able to promoting this among the Konkan area. About 300 farmers are directly in the network that we have generated in the last 10 years' time. These are some of the seeds which are indigenously grown, and their nurseries are established. And the Nima attenuata, some of the rare species are also planted. This is one experiment and exercise that we have actually, it is going on in Sindhudurg district right now from 10:30 onwards. My student who is seen in this picture, he is with his friends and the local communities. They are creating what we call it as future in situ conservation areas. About 48 different species of rare, endangered and endemic nature from IUCN list, red data book, observed in the Western Ghats, where the seeds were collected, cultivated, nurseries were developed, and they are now planted in a microclimatically conducive area where the forest can be generated in few decades' time. So this is a new concept, but we have been revitalizing some of the traditional knowledge with the help of this. In next 3 to 4 minutes, I will come down to community-based biodiversity conservation approach with respect to climate change adaptation. And how do we take it further? How do we take the work that has been put in by the foundation at CAbC, and how do we take, what should be the way forward? And in the last 5 minutes that I have, fortunately, I'll be able to complete my presentation. How can we strengthen community institutions? We can develop methodology within unique practices aimed at building and strengthening community institutions through a participatory process to achieve biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. As a part of this process, local organizations, either government agencies or NGOs in local development and advisory services, we develop capacity, support and guidance in the decision-making process and strengthen the decision-making of local agencies to full autonomy. We also need to work on decision-making processes at the community level, considering agricultural biodiversity as one of the most important livelihoods, particularly in Indian context. Can we come out with a common methodology for CBC? Despite the fact that many development and conservation organizations practice conservation as a means of contributing to sustainable livelihood development and on-the-spot conservation, their concepts and theories in practice of their experiences sharing with regard to the community-based biodiversity management itself is very limited. And therefore, we'll have to inspire new community biodiversity conservation proposition in the new education policy that has been implemented now in India, and we have a conglomeration of 45,000 colleges and over 1,100 universities. With the help of higher education and professional development institutions that include conservation and use of community-based PGR and biodiversity conservation in their curricula, like our chairman had introduced biodiversity conservation curriculum in 1992. But they scarcely incorporate approaches that address conservation and use within livelihood and sustainable development setting. And therefore, the NEP 2020 can take care of this bias. And if we develop conglomeration of higher education institutions and NGOs, the CAbC is holding a meeting day after tomorrow to network universities from all over the country, and it's a great initiative. And this can lead to the formation of future conservation and development professionals for CAbC. This is the last point, and then I will conclude within next 2 slides. Can we address issues of farmers' rights over PGR properly, that is plant genetic resources, to achieve CAbC? The topic of farmers' rights over genetic resources is debated all over, and the debate is complex, conceptual, and political, and it often loses contact with those who really matter. And therefore, through the development of CAbC methodologies and a range of practices, governments through policies and organizations through their implementation can support and improve the ability of agricultural communities to exercise their agricultural rights in a variety of ways. The new approach of CAbC in the context of climate adaptation will encourage farmers to protect their genetic, agriculture, and landscape biodiversity. Its collective nature will allow communities to document, monitor, and make decisions about plant genetic resources. And through standardization of CAbC methodology, farmers can use their genetic resources to improve their crops and trade and sell seeds from local and newly developed varieties. The issue that was brought out by the Business India last month looks at the involvement of corporate leadership in conservation of biodiversity and trying to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And this issue is there, the link is there, you can just use it and look at your laptop. And it can actually try to meet the goals of conservation with the help of community involvement. The second last slide of my presentation talks about Mahatma Gandhi, whom people considered as hope of the world. And he spoke about forget the past, remember every day dawns for us from the moment we wake up. Let us all wake up, everyone wake up now. This was a message given to the world. People talked about it. Hardly anybody was able to implement it, though they imbibed it. And people like Barack Obama, within 7 days after naming Mahatma Gandhi and telling the world that he has been his inspiration, was nominated by the world for Nobel Peace Prize. And Dr. Swaminathan, after spending whole life, doesn't get the recognition, even though people like Norman Borlaug acknowledged openly that he developed the varieties, but the implementation and recognition of those varieties was Dr. Swaminathan's contribution, and he deserves that award more than what he was given. So, Mahatma Gandhi is hope of the world, but modern Gandhi, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, is the one who has practiced hope through ecology. And Swaminathan sir always said, what we are doing is just a drop in the ocean, but the ocean would be less because of that missing drop. I would like to pay my tribute to the father of Green Revolution, the world scientist, a great humanitarian, Dr. Swaminathan. And we are all committed to take forward his message for the world's betterment. I would like to thank all of you for the opportunity. Thank you very much. And this is the home garden model for ex-situ conservation that we have just been planting in that particular village today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Sanjay Deshmukh. Now, the next presentation by K.M. Sri Kumar. on conservation of biodiversity control. Conservation and biodiversity control.
Distinguished chairman of the session, distinguished speakers, and the august audience here. First of all, I thank MSSR for giving me this opportunity to talk before you in this 25th year of its foundation. Many of us used to wonder why Dr. Swaminathan is not getting Bharat Ratna award. He is far more deserving than any other person in the country, but he is not receiving it. Anyway, it's an honor for me to talk before you in this session. I am just talking about a small experiment by me done some years back, that is on conservation biological control. Not conservation and biological control, but conservation biological control in cashew ecosystem. See, the price of cashew is going on, also the area production and productivity of cashew, especially in Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka and Kerala in this part. And the price is also getting higher and higher as the year goes. It's a major foreign exchange crop. And the tea mosquito bug, Helopeltis antony, is a serious pest of cashew. They suck the sap from the cashew and the whole plant will be drying. So you can see from the tender shoots, especially after the monsoon season, they'll start sucking and the plant will be drying. Also the inflorescence will be drying as well as the nuts. This is the attack on nuts. And later on, the feeding injury will be paving way for the entrance of certain pathological fungi, leading to complete blight of the plants. This will be giving around 95 to 100% yield loss. As well as the crop is, sometimes the crop also will go. And management of tea mosquito bug, parasites and predators are not found to be effective. And spraying of insecticide is a viable option. But you know, Kasargod, there is endosulfan tragedy. It's a fraud. It's a case of real fraud. I will talk about it if I get an opportunity. The history of use of red ants. Red ant is a major general predator in the tropical ecosystem. And the first written record of biological control dating back from 305 AD in China. By use of it in citrus. It is said that in the markets of China, the nest of the ants are used given for selling. They are used for pest management in Africa, Asia, and various other countries on various crops, especially tree crops. But with the inception of pesticide technology, this technology went into oblivion. In Australia, Peng and others, they have developed a technology for use of red ants for management of tea mosquito bug. And in 2000s, when the endosulfan controversy arose, our government requested Australian government for this technology, but they said that this is $1 million technology, we are not going to spare it. In North Malabar, this is an ITK. Use of red ants for pest management is an indigenous technical knowledge. Many farmers practice, especially on cowpea. Cowpea for managing cowpea bugs. And also it is observed that if a nest of red ants are there, the mangoes, they flower and yield profusely with a little attack of mango hoppers. So the experiment started in Kannur, in a cashew ecosystem, and focused effort was made to harbor red ants from nearby tree crops and tree plants like teak, thani, mango, marudu, like such plants, there are this redundant nests from which we have tried to bring it to the cashew plants nearby by keeping nylon ropes smeared with fish, so that they will be coming to the targeted areas. And this is how they are taken from one plant to the other by tying with nylon ropes. And food is given, dried fish is given as food so that they will be coming and they'll be moving further. Within hours, the entire fish will be eaten away. And there were total 194 plants. 50% of the plants were harbored on one side of the area. 50% of the plants were harbored with redundants using this technology, and 10 plants were selected. And observation for 3 years were taken. And afterwards, the plants grown up and the branches intermingled. So we could not isolate the plants. And this is how we have taken the observations in a 1 square meter area, how many number of shoots, how many shoots have inflorescence, how many are affected, like. We have taken the observation. And this is a photo of a redundant eating away the tea mosquito bug. And the results for 3 years show that tea mosquito number is highly reduced in the treated plants. You can see the comparison between treated and untreated plants. And inflorescence damage is also very less in the harbored and harbored plants. The shoots damaged are very high in the untreated plants compared to treated plants. And immature nut damage, number of immature nuts are very high in the treated plants. And yield in kilograms, if you look at, the yield is around 4 times higher between treated and untreated. So the unharbored plants produced 4 times higher yield than the harbored plants. And the production extended. Usually the production will be over by May, but in the unharbored plants, the production extended over June because there was continuous fruiting occurring. But the problem is that the number of ant-harbored plants are very less. In a plantation, not all the plants are ant-harbored. And there will be the problem of the competition from other ants. One ant is not favoring the other ant. And the population of ant is very low. The ant population increases from February, March only, but the tea mosquito bug attack happens before that. Tea mosquito bug population will be increasing from October onwards. And by the time red ant increases, the attack is already done. So that was a problem. So we have looked at the population of the red ants in the plantation, in 2-3 plantations in different areas, in where we have seen the pattern that March, April, May, the population is high, but thereafter, at the inception of rains, the population is decreasing drastically, and the population is increasing by next March only, or February, March only. So the population is not sufficient to prevent the damage of tea mosquito bug. So naturally it is not happening in an ecosystem. So this is, where there is a higher biodiversity, you can see in the intercropped area in Thrissur, in Madakatara station, in the intercropped area, the population is higher compared to a pure monocrop of cashew. So this is a patch of red and harbored orchard in our college, that is College of Agriculture, Padanakkad, Kasargod. So what we have done is, we have provided artificial food, that is either fish or chicken shank that is tied very tightly on the plant, and sometimes it is kept in a bag also or in bottles, so that this won't be taken away by birds. So that will be immediately covered with redundants. So they take it and their population increases. So we can increase the population of the redundants very easily in a very limited period. This is over 30 days. There was around 10 times higher increase in redundants population. So when that is applied at the plantation level, we could immediately increase the population of the redundants in the plantation. And we could increase the number of red and harbored plants in a very limited period from the September onwards, September, October, November, December. This is the patch in December, number of ant harbored plants in December. So by this way, we could overcome the limitation of red ant harboring. So when we are providing artificial food, we have tried sugar also. Sugar is providing energy for them. They are coming in large numbers for drinking sugar syrup. And also when we are providing non-vegetarian like chicken shank or fish offal, they are taking it and their population is increasing. So that way we could solve this problem, and we have a technology now. We have a technology now that is red ant technology for management of tea mosquito bug in a cashew plantation, and it is better that if the plantation is not a monocrop, it is an oligocrop or polycrop, this technology will be having a better success. So that's all. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sri Kumar. Thank you very much. Now the fourth and last speaker, Sunita Subramanian, online presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Good day to everyone. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yes, Dr. Sunita. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen now. And I guess, but first, a word of thanks to MSSRF, the organizers, for the kind invitation. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. And is it in full screen mode? I'm sorry, it's a little bit difficult for me to make out if it's. Is it in full screen mode for you too?
Yes, madam.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so again, thanks very much to the organizers for the kind invitation, and I'm really pleased to see a lot of familiar faces, both in the participants that I see online, people I've interacted with closely in the last years on this topic. So the presentation that I will be making in the next couple of minutes, basically, I think is more like more of an inductive reasoning based on all the presentations that were made earlier, starting from Dr. Anil to Dr. Sri Kumar now. It's going, looking at how the perspectives from the ground can be abstracted to actions at a more macro level. But what I will be presenting now is more of a larger canvas picture of how the debates, I mean, the need for conservation of biodiversity is very, very closely linked with the conservation of cultural diversity. Of course, it's not news to people who are here. It's pretty much speaking to the converted, I know. But I'd just like to highlight how this is being played out actually in policy circles. In a couple of minutes, I'll get to that. But before we even get to that, just very, very quickly, a very quick walkthrough two definitions of what biodiversity means and what biocultural diversity means. And I'm just taking it for the standardized versions. So biodiversity literally is about variability, and it's about variability among living organisms, and they could be at, as Dr. Anil already mentioned, it can be at the species genomes, and of course at the ecosystem level too, and it goes across various ecosystems. And this is as defined by the CBD, and pretty much this is this then is not just about having too much of one, but actually having many of many. So it's like if you're talking about a biodiverse forest, then we're actually talking about multiple species out there and not just having a monocrop plantation being called as a forest, which is something that came up as a controversy, in fact, with a lot of forestry, afforestation programs. And then we get into the definition of what biocultural diversity means. This is not, as we all know, it's not new in reality. It's something that has been practiced over generations because it's cultures that define how resources are being used. But it became when securing the rights of indigenous local communities, marginalized people, various social groups became much more robust. When that became quite a topic of debate, certain terms had to be much better defined, and the definition that came about is that it is the diversity of life in all of its manifestations. So it's really very far-reaching, and it rides through biological, cultural, and linguistic aspects. And of course, it's linking it to the complex socio-ecological adaptive management activities. And this is as defined by people who were very active in this area, who advanced this idea quite a bit, led by Louisa Maffei from Terra Lingua. A very quick look at, and this is actually, this echoes with what Dr. Anil was saying in the beginning, that we are looking at a cycle, that it's a loop, the information. So if we are looking at what the biocultural diversity spectrum actually encompasses, it moves all the way from a resource where we're talking about biodiversity, all the life forms that we actually use for various to fulfill several needs. So whether it's resources or ecosystems, and for whatever purposes that we use them, so those are the two aspects that we have: the utility we gain from the resources, but then we have people, that is us in between, and how we relate to these resources and ecosystems. And that relationship could either be, we look at the resources as an instrument to get certain benefits, so to get food, to get medicine, so it's an instrumental value. It could be values that are much more deeper, where we see the connect to the resources and to the ecosystems in a much more personalized manner. It could be cultural, it could be, as totemic species, it could be ceremonial areas, sacred groves, it could be all of that. But how we relate to these resources informs how the kinds of decisions we make on their use and to conserve them. So essentially that is mediated then by the cultural values we actually hold on these resources. And so the spectrum is actually a cycle. So from the resource to use, and then the use again gets, so this culture, the cultural values, this mediation is a dynamic aspect. It's not something that's static, that we just, there's something happens at some time point and then it continues throughout. It keeps getting, it keeps changing because of various reasons, economic, political, social, and these change, and therefore how we view use and utility also changes, and that again informs how we relate to nature. So this is really a continuum, and this needs to be factored in if we are to engage in effective conservation activities, because leaving the human dimension out, leaving how people, what motivations people have towards conservation actually does not help us in the cause of our own well-being. So a very quick look at the broad constituents of human well-being, if you want to call it. I'm just making it a very simplistic, I'm just presenting a very simplistic idea of what human well-being is. And we could broadly say that we have these big basic needs: food, water, food, shelter, health, securities, belonging. But then we have other needs, which include things like dimensions such as self-esteem, identity, a sense of agency, that we actually part of a decision, that we actually have the capacity and the wherewithal to make decisions related to the management, the governance of resources that we want, to the use of resources we want, the practices that we want to follow, and the kind of quality of life that we want to advance in our own lives. And all of this is also linked to human well-being. So this is something that we need to bear in mind And each of these aspects, whether we're talking about food security, health security, or self-esteem and sense of agency, they're not mutually exclusive. They do the actions we take on one will have an impact on another. And that's something, again, that from the examples that were mentioned earlier, we can see, like, for instance, if you're talking about, as Dr. Anil was saying, health foods, it is food security, but it's also, we're talking about nutritional security, and then we're talking about diverse diets, and then having access to a richer, biodiverse, socio-ecological complex. But that means that is also linked to being able to mitigate and adapt to vagaries of climate and other potential disasters that might be there, any kinds of economic shocks that might be there. But these are, and therefore it's important for us to recognize that that these various dimensions of human well-being are inherently tightly linked with the resources that we have access to, and we have to ensure that that access is not curtailed. Just some examples I thought might be useful, but I see that we've already had some discussions in the previous presentations, but to look at that biocultural diversity, for instance, has, of course, informed the various food cultures that are there, and therefore the selection of various staples and the various crops that are grown around the world, the management practices that are out there, the commodities that enter into trade, coming from those that coming from resources from particular landscapes and seascapes. Similarly, for health resources, to the kinds of, it could be medicinal plants, but it could be any sense of medicinal resources. It could be ecosystem, like, I mean, there's a lot that people have discovered about therapeutic landscapes and all of that. And this is, again, linked back to biodiversity and ecosystems, to well-functioning ecosystems. Of course, it's becoming quite big even in the urban planning discourse, that we have to ensure that I mean, that's not it's not greenwashing, but at the same time to ensure that we have sufficient. It's a biodiverse landscape even in urban ecosystems because of the clear link, understanding that a better understanding that is there on human micro interactions and such. And similarly, also looking at it from resources, we can extend the same argument to ecosystems too, where the linkages, there's a lot of conservation that's happening, but it's also refuge centers in terms of sacred groves that are out there, in terms of, and this is sometimes motivated by an understanding of to respect various kinds of species interactions, but broadly that enables various natural processes that in turn helps our own production activities. So just looking at it from a very anthropocentric utilitarian perspective, it does pay for us to, a lot of activities have been advanced just for self-interest, if you want to call it that way. But in a much more deeper sense, it's a much more reciprocal relationship that people have had with nature. In terms of, so what does this imply for, if you are talking about linking biocultural diversity to human well-being? One of the major areas that we need to pay attention to are the kinds of negotiations that often occur, because of course we do know that we are working in finite spaces, and we have to make all kinds of land use and sea use decisions within those finite spaces, which means, and there are all of these stakeholders who have different notions of what is good for them and what is it that is of priority to them. So, which means there's a lot of negotiations that is going on between various active groups and stakeholders, and with each of them, as I mentioned, having different motivations and values related to nature. Sometimes we can get, they might match, and we may come up with cooperative action and a decision fairly quickly. But it's not often the case that these values would match, and we might end up with what's called as incommensurable values, which is there's no way that we could even negotiate and say, like, okay, let's come to a middle path. Like, for instance, we could talk about issues that have come up in terms of where policies have made it mandatory that rotational farming practices, as followed by pastoralists, for instance, be replaced by sedentary cultivation. There's a lot of examples that's coming from Southeast Asia, where they've shown that that's not been really good for the ecosystems and for the diversity of resources that are out there, because it wasn't aligned with the seasonality of the seasonality of the resource growth, and therefore it was there's a lot of evidence that is showing that probably a rethink of this policy is required. It also had a huge impact on the sense of identity that those pastoralists had. Of course, they would abide by the country's policies, but it had a lot of impact on what they saw as security to their food cultures, to their health cultures, to their sense of well-being, because they are naturally nomadic by nature, and they seek different kinds of foods during different periods, and this was not helping them at all. And so there is evidence that is showing that this is probably not a great way to do things in these circumstances. But it has led to conflicts in several areas of the world. Again, we see this in mining related decisions and we've found that, sometimes because there is a comparative advantage, policy does instruct that certain types of crops be preferred for cultivation than others, and of course that might not be in consonance with what the people on the ground really seek in terms of what they want as staples. Although there might be some changes, but in certain cultures, when the political regime is much more stronger and these dominant values can prevail, it has led to several conflicts. So these conflicts, in a way, play out also when there are issues of disturbances, either due to climate-related calamities, and then it becomes a disaster because the ecological system has become very fragile, or just because of certain economic shocks, because there's just one crop that's there and then it gets ravaged, then of course that becomes a problem, and there's a backup is difficult. The germplasm that was existing perhaps to mitigate certain new conditions, maybe flooding or droughts or whatever, those have become scarce. It's becoming hard to find these kinds of germplasm, and that has a huge impact on both the resilience of the socio-ecological system, which means the societal system and the ecological system, they both suffer. But I mean, well, as a system, the socio-ecological system suffers, but that implies that people and the ecology are both impaired.
Sunita, you have 5 minutes left.
Yes, I'm almost done. Thank you. So some recent conceptual developments in policy, and I'm just putting it under 3 big heads. So we have conservation, equity, and development. And in conservation, there's a lot more discussion that we shouldn't be focusing on just protected areas, but move to other effective area-based conservation, which means and then naturally this is going to get into more human-managed land or seascapes. And then we're looking at issues of equity. And then again, there's a better acknowledgement of relational values that people form related to management and governance of nature, and concepts such as rights to nature, customary practices, equitable distribution of benefits, alternate metrics of progress such as gross national happiness, degrowth, circular economy. All of these are concepts that are becoming much more in currency. They are getting into the lexicon of planners now. And if you're looking at development itself, the concept of well-being is being redefined. Again, issues of human rights in environment, looking at identity, pluralistic approaches, adaptive management. All of these are issues that have become much more mainstream. And some international initiatives out there, you have various policy forums, such as the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the FAO, there's a high ambition coalition for people and nature, and of course the partnership that is advocated by the United Nations University, of which MSSRF is a part to, the International Partnership for the Satoyama Initiative. They're all working on ensuring that this linkage between biological and cultural diversity are better acknowledged, and that this, because it's mutually reinforcing the connections between people and nature, that we have to take that approach. So just some key points to note. The whole point of the presentation is not to have an evangelical take on antiquity. I'm not saying that just because that was traditional and all of that, we should focus on that. It is something that is very, very relevant. It is how we operate as a social system, that it's by advocating, by promoting and strengthening biocultural diversity, it acknowledges the various human motivations to decisions related to socio-ecological systems. And this basically also acknowledges that there are various different worldviews and epistemologies. Now, if we do this, and we have the evidence that shows that this has resulted, if we do this exercise, we do end up with well-designed actions for conservation and development policies. And it also recognizes the multiple contextual efforts, which is, there is no one-size-fits-all. And we really need to make it very contextual, all of these various decisions we make, the policy interventions we make, the various actions that we take to a particular site, or a community, or a subnational area, but that they need to be extremely contextual, and that needs to be recognized. So it needs to be a hybrid effort of the policy being supportive of these various, supportive and flexible to various subnational implementation. And of course, it really shows that all solutions at this level or towards socio-ecological resilience need to be systemic, they need to be endogenously led from within. It involves all of society and sectors. It is contextually relevant and adaptive. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita. Now we have time for discussion.
Hello. Thank you all for very interesting presentations. I have two questions. One is to both Anil and Sanjay. You have gave very interesting examples of in-situ conservation in Maharashtra, in Kerala, but I want to link it up. Can you say, is it a success in terms of development? Because I think income and livelihoods and through that development has to be there. And that's why this morning when I think the speaker said climate resilient development, or in this case, development with conservation, and it's recognized in the 4 C's, etc. But have we really succeeded? And what are the constraints? What are the challenges? Where do we go next? How do we ensure that? I'm not saying everything happens in baby steps, but so that's one question which both of you can address, because this makes it sound like it's win-win on every situation. The second question is to Dr. Sunita, and perhaps others as well. Although she said this doesn't mean antiquity and so on, see, food taste, consumption, preferences, these change. So yes, we have traditional foods which are neglected, and we have identified they have properties. We need to bring them back into the diet, but perhaps not in the same way as they were. So I'm a little worried about, when we say traditional foods and traditional food habits and traditional food practices, what is it that we keep and in what form? And I just want to give 2 examples. I was hearing a talk yesterday by George Monbiot, and he said the first keepers of cattle, probably who had milk, never thought there will be a camembert cheese one day. Or today you're talking about lab-based meats that are going to come. So food tastes in Kerala, the amount of influence of Arabic food now so food tastes change all the time. So I think taking tastes and consumption patterns and preferences as kind of static and preserving the traditional, I'm not talking about the foods themselves or the, the biological wealth. I'm talking about the food practices, because this seems to be a little implicit, particularly in Sunita's discussion. So these are my 2 questions or comments. Thank you.
See, always the challenge is creating economic stake in conservation. So this challenge particularly for the tropical region. And if you take India, we are a highly aspirational country. So what we have to do, only one way, market-based incentivization of conservation. That is what I was trying to, or good ecology is, if I take a language of professor, good ecology is good business. And if you take for Kerala, for example, where now this farm-based tourism. See, yesterday there was a project called Ennuru. It's a 10 crore project in Wayanad, where they have this tribal habitation they resurrected, and to attract tourism. So my first suggestion when we say market-based incentivization, looking into the resilience and the conservation, the farm-based tourism, that we have to promote. That is first thing. Second thing is, the Biodiversity Act and the PPFR Act, both are talking about the local gene fund, where you can have this benefit sharing can be shared for the local gene fund. For benefit sharing, but unfortunately, the research has to happen because people have to use the genetic material. Unfortunately, if you take, say, I said about those 360 farmers' varieties, how many farmers' varieties have been used for breeding a new variety? So unless you have such kind of simultaneous practice of exchanging knowledge and exchanging materials between community and scientists, so this is a policy issue rather. So this is where the kind of private, public, government, people partnership. So these, unless it is happen, you cannot see. You are glorifying conservation, and conservation. After some time, by 2030, your sustainable development horizon, by the time we will lose. So promote sustainable and equitable use. There is an umbrella thing, but through the market incentivization, for which facilitators like us, what we are doing actually, we are trying to facilitate. We need such kind of facilitation, facilitating centers at the community level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anil, and thank you, Dr. Madura, for this very important question. Fortunately, in Maharashtra, the work that we have been doing in the last 20 years, we were able to establish an NGO in looking at two sectors, particularly acknowledging the traditional knowledge of tribal communities who practice bamboo-based interventions, and also looking at the medicinal plants, the people who have traditional knowledge. In these two segments, we were able to acknowledge not only the traditional knowledge, but also were able to provide larger incentives by involving and training the communities who were traditionally bamboo craftsmen communities, and we enhanced their abilities to produce high quality products. And the NGO that we set up, we also then converted that into a private enterprise, and the people who were employed were the people who were traditional practitioners of bamboo interventions, and they are now shareholders in that company where the products made by them are sold to the corporate sectors, and various corporate sectors like private hotel industry and the private enterprises are subscribing to those products. With respect to the medicinal plants, the traditional knowledge of people as well as the community-based conservation, I'll just give you one example of Mamia suriga, the plant which can give you tremendous dividends. There are only 6 plants in a village in Sindhudurg district, and the produce that it provides during the summer season, during the flowering season, an economy of 1.75 crores is based on only those 6 individual plants, and they are more than 150-year-old trees. They have been preserved and taken care of by the villagers, and the group Gram Panchayat involving 6 villages are accruing the benefits of 1.75 crores, and they are equitably shared by sheer conservation and utilization of the resource. So there are possibilities and examples of providing incentives or recognizing the traditional knowledge and providing them dividends in a small pocket. It is not come to the light at global level, but the governments which are now doing justice to recognizing the role of Panchayati Raj institutions, the Maharashtra government has started an experiment of linking 27,000 villages with the optical fiber cable. Every Gram Panchayat is going to be linked with optical fiber cable. And we are trying to develop a startup. The company is just registered. And we are trying to look at the produce that the farmers from individual Gram Panchayats are able to come out with, and whether they can be directly linked with the market. So this is not the direct intervention of biological diversity conservation or the traditional knowledge, but this system can also be used for recognizing the role of communities and providing them incentives with respect to giving the knowledge to the various sectors. For example, Jhandu or Sandu pharmaceuticals, which have base in Mumbai, they look for the plant parts, and there is so much of adulteration because nobody is able to recognize properly which are the precise plants that are utilized for making medicines. So these tribal communities are also recognized by NGOs like ours, and we provide them an exposure to the linkages with the medicinal plant company, and those are able to then utilize their knowledge in identifying the right plant, and the people who are middlemen who collect the medicinal plants on large scale, these people are linked with them, and they are able to then identify those from the forest areas and provide right kind of produce to the people for making medicines. So these are some examples which are coming up. The information technology has contributed a lot, and there is a hope, I am sure, that the communities will get recognition in due course. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon all. I'm Prajesh.
No, Prajesh, one second. There is a question for Dr. Sunita also from Dr. Madura. Yeah. Dr. Sunita, you are online?
Yes, I am. So please. Let me quickly respond. For some reason, my previous got okay. Thank you, Dr.
Sunita, your voice is breaking, little bit. Check the mic. Yeah, now it's better.
All right. Okay, so let me very quickly respond. So I didn't mean to say that we should continue with an old form of consumption or production activity itself, and that's something that so the whole point of adaptive management and to take decisions on a flexible with a flexible approach was that we take on board these changes, because values change. People, even at the community level, keep changing their priorities due to various reasons over time. But the point is also that, there are very many worldviews, and that's the point that you also making, Dr. Madura. So there are stakeholders, there are actors who are doing cutting-edge research with ways to address, for instance, food security issues through technological interventions, right? And also there's a lot that, but we do know that one of our biggest assets, for instance, just in this direction of food security, one of our biggest assets is the other resources that are already there in nature because of the constant stressors to which these different varieties are constantly exposed. So they adapt and therefore come up with their own solutions that are much more easier for us to use, to run with, since we would have access to them. So if we destroy them, then it's a destruction. Now, one of the things that's been happening, we are all aware that we are losing biodiversity we have lost a lot, and we are continuing to lose biodiversity at an alarming rate. The best global assessment very clearly pointed out the numbers too, which itself is considered a very rough approximation. But one of the reasons that was very clearly identified was that we didn't give enough emphasis to the human dimensions of the solution rubric. Our whole emphasis was that we can contain this loss through technical solutions. We know how to control, we know how to conserve. We fence an area, we make it a protected area, we do all of these actions in situ, whereas much of this degradation is happening where people are actively managing areas, and they are not necessarily just happening. Much of this is happening in areas beyond the control of communities, or they are subjected to having to, dissolve or merge into larger mainstreaming processes. So, and that is something that has been explicitly recognized now, that we have that, and there's the other big finding from the global assessment of effects was that even now the degree of if there is some conservation that we can say conservation success that's happening, it's actually happening in areas that are managed by indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's a fact. So that's basically because of the way it's a different relationship, and it's a different worldview that is out there. So if the context is on biodiversity conservation, then there's something there that we really need to take into account to see what is it that motivates people to actually go ahead and conserve and then facilitate that process. So it's pretty much speaking to what the kinds of actions that, for instance, at the CAbC you're doing, because it speaks to those motivations of people. It speaks to those what will incentivize people to actually indulge in conservation and sustainable use kind of behavior, sustainability aligned behavior patterns. So it's not to say that we don't go to value addition, to looking at various technological fixes. It really needs to be a bridging between various worldviews and integration of different kinds of actions that are possible, but not leaving out one over the other. So that's the point that I was trying to make. So, but it's mediated by really cultural views. So it's like what gets into the commodities that get into the global markets. A lot of it is determined, the consumption is determined by what is it that we wish to consume, right? And that has a reflection on what is being produced and how these are being produced. So if we are going to argue for more sustainable products, then that has to be reflected vice versa. It goes through multiple actors, but that's something that we need to embed already. And there's a lot that's happening on the ground that needs strengthening and uptake at the policy level if this needs to be taken seriously at the level of national planning and facilitation. So that was the point that I was trying to make.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita.
Prajesh, please.
Yeah. So, good afternoon, I'm Prajesh. I work with MSSRF.
Little louder.
It's not a specific question to any of the speakers, but I just thought of putting this point on floor for some reflections. It's basically about rights of nature. People have started arguing for rights of nature. Recently also we had a couple of court verdicts on rights of rivers and all. So we have a handful of laws in India, a handful of terminologies like biodiversity hotspot, cold spot, agrobiodiversity hotspot, then biodiversity heritage sites in Biodiversity Act itself. Then we also have CApC, socially, ecologically, production landscapes and all. So sometimes many of these handful of terminologies will be a bit confusing. So to my understanding, the best way to get it forward is like strengthening biodiversity management committees to identify and better manage the biodiversity heritage sites, because it is a mandatory provision under the Biological Diversity Act. So that's my point. Thank you.
You give the mic there, Narayan.
Thank you. I am Narayanan. I have one quick question to Dr. Sri Kumar and one observation and a suggestion, if you will allow. Shall I ask one after the other? Mr. Chairman?
Yes, yes.
The quick question to Dr. Sri Kumar is very good biological control experiment. Can't you culture the red ants like they culture the other parasites and like tracheogramma and other things in the laboratory rather than getting the infestation or no attempts have been made to try that?
Sir, I didn't try culturing red ants in the laboratory because these ants require a lot of foraging space. They want a lot of movements. So that way in a laboratory there are limitations for them, for culturing. Maybe on a plant.
My suggestion is that you should probably try, for example, the robber flies and various other things which also roam around.
Yes.
They have been conditioned to lab culturing. That may be a useful way of intervention.
Yes.
Now, sir, if you allow me,
Cuba
Mr.
and Vietnam, in Cuba and Vietnam, there are reservoirs of red ants in the villages. From there, they harvest the nest and take it to the farmlands.
Okay, something similar to that.
Yeah, such things can happen. Yes.
Can I continue with my observation and the suggestion?
Yes, sure.
Mr. Chairman? Okay, I think a lot of good things were discussed this morning. And I think Anil rightly said, invoked the two Biodiversity Act as well as the Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act. I want to conflate that with an observation made by the first presenter, Dr. Jaiswal, this morning, that rules and regulations should be climate or environment informed decisions that should be taken. Now, it's been over a decade since these two acts have been implemented in the country. But we find that there are many, many challenges in adopting that. While it's important to be informed about the climate impact, the environmental impact, I think as rational and scientific people, it is important to keep the emotions out of the debate or the discussions. When we are discussing outsides, those things come. The compulsions to be politically correct. I was encouraged when Sri Kumar said, that the endosulfan issue is a fraud. Whatever it is, there can be two sides to it. But when we think about scientific discussions or based on scientific principles, I think empirical evidence should be the basis rather than emotions. Why I say this is because particularly in issues related to environment, conservation of biodiversity, there is always an existential dilemma, like we have in many other issues. For example, adaptation versus conservation. See, there is always this divide between the global north and the global south, whereas the adjectives which describe the activity for conserving biodiversity, there are two major ones. For example, there is shared responsibility. Whereas there is another word which also says differentiated responsibility. While the North would like to focus on shared responsibility, we in the South sometimes try to emphasize on differentiated responsibility. So there will always be emotions and politics into this debate, but here at the Community Agro-Biodiversity Center can be a clearinghouse for validation, for empirical validation of some of these technologies. I will say a few more words last and then I will close. Rules and regulations are very, very important. And I would try to compare them with a good braking system in an automobile. Don't be surprised. I think intuitively you may think that a braking system is for enabling an automobile to be stopped or prevent it from moving. But I believe that if a car has a good braking system, it will be able to travel much faster because it can avoid the dangers. I think that should be the view that we should take in trying to formulate these regulations. And I think it is high time that we revisit the Biodiversity Act as well as the Protection of Plant Varieties and Breeders' Rights Act, and then make sure that some of these issues which are bugbears today, which are matters of complaint, which is acting as a brake, which kind of is constantly pressed, in which case the vehicle itself is, the utility of the vehicle itself becomes questionable. I think that needs to be readdressed. So that can be a task before us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope the reporters have noted down these points and then please submit. Any other question? Yes, please.
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Anil Kumar. This is in relation to institutions which support biodiversity conservation. And we have mixed responses from CAbC centers because we have been promoting several institutions in the context of promoting different kind of bioresources. So meantime, we have introduced the biodiversity bill-based institutions, that is Panchayat Raj. In this context, how do you see the challenges in forthcoming days, because your whole systems are getting changed, your cultural systems are changing, government institutions are increasingly coming in changing the whole management systems. So which kind of institutions and what are all the challenges you are envisaging in the future days to come? Thank you.
Oh, that's a good question in the sense, whether you have to go for your historical or culturally decided institutions or democratically elected and represented institutions. I would say both are important because it is location specific. What is our problem is we want to see a kind of uniform approach for every. Solutions are not you cannot go with a uniform approach, particularly for India. It's so diverse. So my suggestion, say for example, a progressive state like Kerala. So we have these grassroots institutions, Panchayat Raj institutions are very strong. We should be able to empower them. Now if you take, as the morning Shashindran was here, our biodiversity management committees, though in paper the committees are there, but there are no active management committees. So though this act is 20 years old, this act, it may be a good braking system, but I won't say it is a braking system, it should be an accelerator. Because this accelerator, unless you accelerate, because the time is so high. To your question, so in the institutions are location specific. You need cultural institutions wherever it is specific, and we also need grassroots institutions, but empowered with whether it is climate resilience or biodiversity, the nature, the environmental dimension of the development. That dimension of the development, people by and large ignore. There is no emotion there. It is it is a fact.
Thank you. Any other question?
So, I'm a farmer, first of all. So my doubt is whether whenever we talk about conservation of biodiversity, degradation, or damage to the biodiversity and all that, we are referring to a particular community that is farming community or village level degradations. But what about the, conservation or biodiversity degradation in the urban population? Because the vicinity of an urban population that is more influential to the degradation level of, especially when we talk about this food basket changing and all that. Food basket has changed completely, as Mr. Swaminathan has correctly said. So there is an influence between the style of living in the even village level. They aspire to have an urban style of living. Maybe that is one factor which is, shifting in a cultural shift that you have correctly said here. Now about so whether the development, what exactly is, in what form or in which direction we should, trigger or propel our development, that is more important. It's not very easy to go back into some centuries back, old culture and all that. So how can we merge between this urban population style of living and village level style of living? We cannot have two style of living at all. So this is, I think, whenever I observe the shift in changes of cultural activity, even the agricultural activities and all that, and it was agriculture earlier, now it is agri-business. So when you put some incentive, some monetary aspects into all these things and all that, the population or the farmers are naturally having a thinking to shift to a style of living for which they have more money, they should have more money and all that. They cannot have the lifestyle of a doctor or an engineer and all that. So the cultural practices, even the agricultural practices change. So so that's why the crop changing and all that is happening in Kerala, especially in Wayanad and all that. Earlier, there were a lot of paddy fields and all that. Now it has been shifted to banana or arecanut and all that. Why that shift? Because it's only monetary aspect. Why this money? Because they wanted a better style of living. And why this better of living? Who is having this better style of living? Whether a villager or an urban man, or a doctor or a farmer. This is a conflict that is going on in our society. And that is why this shift changes, even our, food basket change and all. Because we are running an eco shop in Calcutta. We tried to sell these traditional tubers and all that. But there is not much takers for that. Even if we thrust them in melas and all that, a lot of melas we conducted and all that. And very, very, very small percentage of the population come and ask for a diascoria or, some tuber crops. So everybody wanted some potato or even winter, tomato and brinjals or cauliflower or cabbages and all that. So why this shift is taking place even in a village community? Even in our villages now, especially in the Kerala villages and all that, you can see they are not using much of our traditional food habits are slowly going out. So when we talk about this conservation of biodiversity, we should first think about the urbanization that is going very fast. And this urbanization, that is the process of urbanization, is taking our strength of the biodiversity conservation which we were having the older days. And this nature-based nature-based solutions and all that, we were trying it earlier. Even now there are very few patches of these sacred groves and all that in our country, in our place. Even those few patches now we are not able to control properly. There is a level of damage done to that. So all these aspects, so that is my main question, whether we can compromise this development without looking at the urban civilization that is happening.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for your suggestion. 2 minutes for Dr. Srikumar. Can you please take 2 minutes and briefly issue?
Thank you, Chairman, for giving this opportunity to clear the doubts about the endosulfan issue, what is actually happening. Because scientific agriculture is always helping to conserve biodiversity. So endosulfan issue is a scathing attack on scientific agriculture. That's why I am explaining this. See, this is my paper that has come in Economic and Political Weekly last year with regard to endosulfan issue. This is evidence-based inquiry into the endosulfan tragedy in Kasaragod, Kerala. See, this is in Australia, endosulfan was used for around 60 years, and that to aerial spraying also in cotton ecosystem. And in Africa, around 20 years for aerial spraying to control, to manage, it's a fly. So in these two areas, there are no issues with regard to human health. Only from Kasaragod such an issue has come. So that is why we have looked into it in deep. So this APVMA says that if endosulfan is applied, then the quantity that reaches a human body, even if it is unprotected, is so little that will be immediately, within a week, that will be completely go out of the system. So it won't create any issue. That is APVMA is saying. And then I have collected information from the local area, that is Kasaragod. I am also hailing from Kasaragod, where 2 medical camps were conducted in 11 Grama Panchayats where this endosulfan was sprayed, and also 4 apex camps, and around 16,000 people were examined. And the data I have got, and I have analyzed the data and compared it with the prevalence, and as well as national average prevalence. If you take any of the issues, that is cerebral palsy, epilepsy, congenital hydrocephalus, and congenital hypothyroidism, there is no difference between the national average prevalence as well as the prevalence in that area. Then incidence of syndromes in the endosulfan area, sprayed area, compared to national average. If you look at that also, there is not much difference. So everywhere, such central nervous system insults and syndromes takes place. It is there everywhere. But in Kasaragod area, it is focused much, but it is not compared by anybody. Then there is a very strong exercise conducted by all the states, that is disability census, and that was conducted in Kerala also. The report is available in the net, and I have gone to the raw data of it and analyzed. So in this case, if you take nationally, around 2 crore 68 lakh people are having different types of disabilities, not only in Kasaragod. All over India, there are disabilities. And in Kerala, 7 lakh 93 thousand people are having disabilities, not only in Kasaragod. And it comes about 2.3% of the total population of the state. And then their conditions are just immediately. Then I have conducted one study, that is, in the sprayed Grama Panchayats, all the wards near to the sprayed area and all the wards away from the sprayed area. 48 wards compared with 115 wards. 17 types of disabilities I have compared. There is no statistical difference between the sprayed or the wards near the estates and away from the estates. There are no difference. And also between the sprayed panchayats as well as unsprayed panchayats, no difference. And also prevalence of total disabilities between sprayed and unsprayed panchayats, statistically it is not different. And in the unsprayed Grama, if you take individually also, there are no difference. Totally also as well as individually, there are no statistical difference between these diseases. So the conclusion is that there are no higher prevalence of any type of disability in the sprayed area compared to unsprayed area. It's a media hype. Strikes by alleged victims showing the disabled persons continuously created a notion that there is a higher prevalence. No proper epidemiological study conducted by different organizations as well as institutions. No proper, the science is not for solving the issues of the society. The government is playing for the gallery by providing continuous financial assistance. Because such people are there in Wayanad, in Idukki, in Trivandrum, everywhere such people are there. But here alone, a lot of amount is being dispersed. So that is creating an imbalance in the society. So nobody has done this comparison of the disabilities. Nobody has done. We have done it. That is why I am presenting. Thank you for giving this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Now it is my duty to conclude the session. I have great appreciation to these 4 presenters who have done very well, presented their observations in a very detailed way during the short period of 20 minutes allotted to them. They have presented on biodiversity, biodiversity laws, depletion, climate change related issues, and also mentioned about some of the major mitigative measures that we have to take to conserve the existing biodiversity. We know that there has been major change all over the world during the past couple of years, couple of decades. And we have seen that climate change is a fact, no doubt about it. At the same time, this type of changes in the habitat, climate in general, are also natural to some extent. And that is the final result that we say as evolutionary change. But the problem here is such changes are very slow. But what we see these days, very fast. And that is why we say that there are involvement of human activities in relation to these faster changes. And that is why we are here. And particularly this institute is taking up a lot of activities, lot of measures, lot of conservation related issues, also taking to the public. In my opinion, and also as presented by the presenters here, there are 3 major levels of stakeholders in this issue. Number 1, the farmers, traditional farmers. And also I'm happy that we have few farmers, and at least one of the farmers mentioned some of the very important issue in this context. The urbanization process and related issues as well. Yes, farmers, then scientists and NGOs, institutions of this time, and then executives at the level of government. There is absolutely no doubt that these 3 levels of stakeholders should act in an integrated way, in a friendly way, rather than criticizing others. And that is one of the very important issues if we have to follow and if we have to take up conservation issues, conservation of biodiversity in an effective way. Mitigative measures, very important. And here also one of the presenters specifically mentioned about some of the case studies in Maharashtra. We have a specific case study in cashew plantations using predatory organisms and the improvement of crop and related issues, definitely, which also will help our farmers. So these are scientific informations that, and it is our duty to take these among the public. Farmers are poor, mostly, traditional farmers particularly. And if we invite them and sit in a hall like this and present some of these issues in other languages, they may not be able to follow at all. So it is only NGOs who may be able to take up these issues, translate into their own languages, and inform them in a proper way the scientific advancements that we have gained during the past couple of decades. It's very essential. And I hope that this institute will take up this issue very seriously. Now to conclude, I feel I will fail if I do not mention the name of Professor Swaminathan in another context. When I was a student, master's student, several times I heard his name, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, the father of Green Revolution in India. And it was his initiative that helped India to produce large quantities of foods in different parts of India. And we have attained self-sufficiency in food production. And so we have enough food to eat now. And definitely I have to mention him in that context, in addition to the context of biodiversity conservation. Thank you very much. Thank you one and all.
On behalf of the organizers, I profusely thank the chair, Dr. Balakrishnan, Dr. Anil, Dr. Sanjay, Dr. Sri Kumar, Dr. Sunita for their valuable insights on the theme biodiversity conservation. With this, we close this session, and there are a couple of in-house announcement, and the food is served in 2 locations, in the dining hall and also outside, and we request all of you to join. Thank you. We 2:45. So we also request you to reconvene here at 2:45 p.m.